Why isn't everyone registered to vote? The right to vote does not exist in the federal Constitution. The Constitution acknowledges our rights to talk, to pray, and to shoot things, but the fundamental right to participate in the political process through voting appears nowhere in our organizing document. That's not surprising when you consider the group of burgeois white male slaveholders and burgeois white male friends of slaveholders who wrote the Constitution. The white merchant elites who were desperate to gain political representation for themselves and their shuttlecock buddies had no intention of sharing political power with anybody else. They didn't want poor people to be able to vote, and they didn't want working people to be able to vote. It almost goes without saying that they didn't want women people to be able to vote or have a voice in the laws their husbands passed for them. And they obviously didn't want black people to be able to vote because they didn't consider black people so much as occasionally mouthy farm equipment who could be raped, slaughtered, or used as beasts of burden as the white people who wrote the Constitution saw fit. People who defend the morally decrepit, wealthy white founding generation will justify the exclusion of a right to vote from the Constitution as an example of federalism, the American idea that rights flow up from the disparate states instead of down from a centralized federal government. In this view, voting rights are conferred by state governments, not the federal one. Defenders of federalism believe that the states, which they sometimes call the incubators of democracy, are best positioned to decide who gets to vote. Their argument would be somewhat compelling if the states and their individual constitutions weren't lathered in the same anti democratic dog shit as the federal government's is. But rest assured, the same white male racist and misogynist who couldn't be bothered to erect national voting rights were also in charge of restricting voting rights at the state level. States, both South and North, explicitly prohibited black people and women from voting, and almost every state at the signing of the Constitution had property requirements white men needed to meet in order to earn the ability to vote, though this had been broadly repealed before the Civil War. But the white men who bestowed voting rights on themselves and nobody else knew exactly what they were doing. They were not mere prisoners of their moment in history, for there were other, better white men who told them in real time that a republic that restricted voting rights to only rich white people was hypocritical trash. Some pleaded and lobbied the founding fathers to expand the franchise to more people and tried to enact state laws that allowed at least poor white men also to participate in the government. But those voices were rebuffed by the people who wrote the Constitution. One famous example of a less despicable white man was James Sullivan of Massachusetts. Sullivan was an opponent of British colonial rule, one of the first to call for a continental Congress, and a successful revolutionary. After the war, Sullivan would go on to serve as Attorney General for Massachusetts and eventually as governor. But he also kept a lively correspondence with John Adams, a constitutional drafter who became the second president of the United States. In 1776, Sullivan proposed liberalizing Massachusetts' voting requirements by lowering the property requirements needed to vote. Sullivan also supported granting women the franchise and was an early advocate for the rights of children. Adams opposed all of this and told Sullivan exactly why in a letter. According to Adams, poor men, specifically those who do not own land, cannot be trusted to vote because very few men who have no property have any judgment of their own. Evidently, men without property are too little acquainted with public affairs to form their own opinions and will vote as they are directed by some man of property, such as their landlord, who has attached their minds to his interest. Moreover, Adams believes that if poor people are allowed to vote, then women and children would also eventually demand the franchise. He says, quote, "There will be no end of it. Women will demand a vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will think their rights not enough attended to, and every man who has not a farthing will demand an equal voice with any other in all acts of state." End quote. That's a huge problem for Adams because he thinks children are children and women whose delicacy renders them unfit for practice and experience in the great business of life are like children, but with boobs, so they have to spend their diminished mental capacity engaged with the necessary nurture of their children. That nature has made them fittest for domestic cares. Adams is using the specter of women and children voting to deny poor people the right to vote the same way a modern person might say. Next, you'll be telling me dogs should have a right to vote. But here's the real politic rub. What Adams is actually saying is that if women and children and poor white people are allowed to vote, rich white people won't accept the outcome. His letter asks, how then does the right arise in the majority to govern the minority against their will? And references the obligation of the minority to obey. He's doing this to raise the issue that powerful white men simply won't submit to the authority of the government if that government is based on the majority rule of all the people in the country or in a state. He's saying straight out that wealthy whites will reject democracy if democracy does not produce the outcomes desired by the rich and powerful. Adams is not really worried that poor people will vote as their landlords direct them to. He's worried that they won't. And if they don't, that means Adams' very small white class will be outnumbered in its new democracy. Adams surmised that powerful whites simply won't stand for that. Voting must be restricted to only wealthy white men because wealthy white men won't listen to anybody else. Adams explained in his own time, with his own words, the anti democratic heart that animates the entirety of American style democracy. The American experiment is not and has never been an experiment in democracy or Republican self government. It has always been an exercise in wealthy white male domination over anybody else, and the only question that has been how long those whites can get away with it before everybody else comes together to defeat them. The wealthy white male winning streak has lasted 248 years as of this writing, and unless there is a Visigoth army training somewhere in Canada that I don't know about, it's set to go on for quite a bit longer. The voting laws in this country are designed from their inception and with intentionality to maintain this permanent wealthy white male rule. You can draw a line from fucksticks like John Adams to the Confederate secessionists to the modern Republican Party, right to the white supremacists who stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Voting rights are never about who has the right to vote. They're always about who has the right to win and who has the right to rule. We see that whenever the white patriarchal class loses, whenever the duty of the minority to obey falls to them, the losing white folks act a fool. They react with violence. They dispute the results of the election. They fire on Fort Sumter. And when they regain power, the first thing they do is restrict voting rights and voting access to try to prevent people from using democracy to defeat them again. The lack of a right to vote is not an oversight in our constitutional system. It's not a bug. It's the key defining feature of our polity. America has not had a fully free and fair election in its entire history. The wealthy white folks running the place simply won't allow it. To stop them, to rip out America's foul, anti-democratic heart and try, for once, to have an actual democratic election in this country, we don't need new laws or new constitutional amendments. We've had new laws and new constitutional amendments that the white ruling class have found far too easy to mitigate or outright ignore. To start to fix this problem, we need to start repealing laws, specifically voter registration laws. All of them, everywhere. Every single voter registration law is an anti-democratic anathema. Every single one is designed to prevent people from voting. Not one of them is necessary for election security or to combat voter fraud. Even if you are one of those absolute mouth-breathing idiots who thinks voter fraud is an actual problem in this country, it's not. You should be capable of understanding that voter registration does nothing to prevent voter fraud, if for no other reason than most every fraudster is stealing somebody's identity based on the information provided through voter registration. If anything, you voter ID people should be the most in favor of eliminating voter registration laws because forcing people to show up on voting day with government-issued identification obviates any conceivable need for pre-election day registration. It is important to make a distinction between voter registration requirements and voter eligibility requirements. I could make an argument that all voter eligibility rules are anti-democratic, but the reality is that voter eligibility rules have been a part of every democracy that we know of. If you roll the tape all the way back to ancient Athens, you'll find voter eligibility requirements. Some eligibility requirements make sense and are largely unavoidable. Take For instance, a residency requirement. It makes sense for a polity to restrict voting access to only those who live there. You don't want Spartans showing up on election day and voting for Athens to disband its navy. Other eligibility requirements are less defensible. In Athens, women couldn't vote, nor could enslaved people, yet both groups were certainly permanent residents of the city state and expected to live under its laws. Citizenship and property requirements also make little sense in terms of voter eligibility. If you live somewhere, you should have a say in how you are governed, regardless of where you were born or how much money you have. In a just democracy, all who are expected to abide by the laws should have a vote. But I digress. While voter eligibility requirements are endemic to democracies and republics and theoretically necessary at some minimal level, voter registration is not. In ancient times, property assessors served the function most analogous to modern voter registration. Back when voting was tied to wealth, the people who recorded how much land a person owned provided a soft form of voter registration. Pericles didn't have to register, but his wealth was recorded, and thus both his land and status as a penis having male could be verified when he showed up to vote on election day. The idea that somebody who meets all of the eligibility rules should have to pre register before they are allowed to participate in the election is relatively new. The idea that the onus should be on the voter to provide and prove their eligibility, as opposed to it being the responsibility of the state to figure it out, is a largely American invention. Voter registration isn't a concept that we got from Athens or English common law, and it doesn't come to us through the Constitution or the laws of the various states at the founding of the country. The first voter pre registration law in this country didn't show up until 1800 in John Adams' own Massachusetts, and like every voter pre registration law since, it was designed to suppress the participation of eligible voters. The Massachusetts law worked a little bit like ancient property assessors. Each town was ordered to provide lists of eligible voters in their jurisdiction based on their property holdings and whether they were up to date on their taxes prior to election day, and those lists would be posted at polling places. The rationale was that election administrators couldn't know everybody who met the property requirements, so your name had to be on the pre approved list in order to vote. The problem was that these assessments for the purposes of voting were not comprehensive. It was easy for the assessors to skip or miss potentially eligible voters that the town leaders didn't want to include. And as people like James Sullivan lowered the property requirements, putting pre registration laws in place allowed local rich folks who wanted to protect their status to sidestep the liberalized eligibility thresholds by simply not assessing everyone's property correctly. An appeals process existed, but in order to appeal, you had to know that you weren't on the registration list to begin with, information you didn't necessarily have until the lists were posted on election day. The Massachusetts law didn't catch on. Other states didn't immediately introduce their own voter registration laws. Most communities were small, the kinds of places where everybody knew everybody else. There was no need to pre register. That started to change in the middle of the 1800s as America started to face waves of immigration. Even as property requirements were dropped, some states and communities became interested in voter registration. The first voter registration law in New York was passed in 1840, but curiously applied only to New York City. Voting rights expert Alexander Kisar, author of The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in the United States, writes that the New York law was widely regarded as a partisan effort by the Whig Party to limit the political participation of Irish immigrants, many of whom lacked the time, resources, and education to comply with the registration process. Still, New York City's voter registration law was seen for the xenophobic trash that it was and was repealed just 2 years later. Voter registration laws didn't really take off in this country until after the Civil War. I'll give you one guess as to why. From Kisar again, this was a period of rapid social and political change, thanks to immigration and urbanization in the North and the enfranchisement, for a time, of African Americans in the South, and concerns about electoral fraud mounted among traditional elites who feared losing political power. Strong registration laws, they argued, would help to preserve the purity of the ballot box. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? It turns out that fake concerns about election security and fraud have always been used to justify voter registration laws that are clearly aimed at suppressing the votes of Black and brown people and new Americans. Voter registration laws are not about keeping ineligible voters from voting. They've always been about discouraging eligible voters from participating. And they've worked. The rash of post Civil War voter registration laws in the late 19th century was a body blow to participation in democracy from which this country has never recovered. In 1876, 81.8% of eligible voters voted in the presidential election, the high watermark for U.S. electoral participation in a national election. It's never been that high again. In the 2020 presidential election, only 66.8% of eligible voters voted. Yet that pathetic figure is literally the highest it's been since 1900. Our current world, where a third of eligible voters sit at home on the couch, is the best we've done since voter registration laws became ubiquitous. I'd like to blame all of that decreased voter turnout on voter registration rules alone, but a lot of factors are undoubtedly in play, including the fact that the modern electorate is much bigger than it was in 1900 in terms of raw population and the new classes of people eligible to vote in the first place. One particularly interesting issue is that the 1888 election was the last before the widespread adoption of the secret ballot. It blows my mind, but prior to that, people in many states did not regularly fill out their own ballots printed with the names of every candidate, or they verbally affirmed their votes at their polling places. Instead, each party in a given ward would issue ballots for all the candidates in that party. The people stuffing ballot boxes did not come from people voting multiple times under fraudulent identities. That functionally never happens. What did happen was, at one point in the mid 19th century, party bosses were literally stuffing non legal ballots into ballot boxes or filling false bottomed ones with already filled out ballots, leading to the introduction of the glass ballot box, which allowed people and party bosses to monitor the votes. The secret ballot, which was adopted from Australia, probably did have some effect on reducing voter participation. It's weird to think of the secret ballot as a voter suppression technique, but it kind of is. It's easy to take a pre printed ballot, one that has been approved by your church or union or friends, and then just hand it to whomever comes around to collect your votes, especially when the collectors show up at your job or your local bar. It's a lot harder to take time out of your day, especially your workday, to go to a polling place, stand in line, and fill out a ballot that is often full of candidates you don't really know pushing issues you're not really informed about. It's not that people are lazy. Being fully informed on all the issues in an election is basically a full time job that most people justifiably don't have time for in their busy lives. It's also that people don't like feeling stupid. Filling out your own ballot can feel like a kind of test, and if you don't know the difference between Congressman James Johnson and Congressman John Jameson, an unfortunate but reasonable reaction is not to sit for the test at all. And don't even get me started on how ballots themselves can be designed in confusing ways, purposely so to increase the barriers to participation. If you are young enough never to have heard of the butterfly ballot used in Palm Beach County, Florida in 2000, which resulted in thousands of registered Democratic voters unwittingly voting for proto fascist Pat Buchanan for president when they meant to vote for Al Gore, be happy that you didn't have to live through one of the dumbest moments in American history. Despite all of this, I'm a fan of the secret ballot and think that the voter suppression it introduced is outweighed by other factors. Simply forcing people to show up to vote or mail their votes in and allowing them to do so privately if they so choose is the thing that reduces the threat of voter fraud. The secret ballot is how I know elections aren't rigged, because voting in private makes it very hard to place fraudulent votes into the system. There's no easy way now to stuff a ballot box with extra votes unless you've also got the Postal Service on board or have some other way to commit massive mail fraud. To steal an election now, you have to lose or disable entire voting machines or get to the vote counters and have them not count votes. Not that I want to give Republicans any additional ideas. This is a critical part of the voter registration story because most of the problems voter registration was meant to solve were in fact solved by the adoption of the secret ballot and the exclusion of pre filled ballots. A real person with a real name really has to fill in their own ballot. Should a fraudster wish to fill out 100 ballots on behalf of 99 invented people, that fraudster is likely to be caught by a paper trail that extends beyond a newspaper clipping. And just to be real for a second, even if a con artist has the time and dedication to fill out multiple secret ballots, their ability to influence an entire election is statistically insignificant. We don't have dead people voting 100 times, and even if we did, in a country of 330 million people, it wouldn't matter very much to the results. In contrast, voter registration prevents no fraud. A person submitting 100 fake ballots would be pretending to be 100 registered voters. Without voter registration, the fraudster would be pretending to be 100 eligible voters. There is no difference. The people who think voter registration enhances election security are probably the same people who think an AR 15 will protect them from government tyranny. When it comes to election integrity, voter registration is a placebo. When you strip away the election security rationale for voter registration laws, you're left with purely administrative justifications. Pre registration, we are told, helps elections run smoothly because election day workers won't be burdened with verifying that every voter is eligible to vote. The administrative rationale is bullshit. We live in a dystopian fucking future where Amazon knows that I need to buy new underwear before I do, but we're supposed to pretend that it is difficult for the US government to know if I'm eligible to vote? Come on. I was born at night, but not last night. You can learn everything you need to know about my eligibility requirements with just my name and address if you use a little known software application called Google. I don't want to think about what you can know about me if you have my social security number. I don't want to contemplate what the government would know about me if they ran my face through one of their proprietary facial recognition databases I'm sure exist. Voter eligibility can be ascertained damn near instantaneously, no pre registration required. Establishing that a voter is who they say they are is to some a trickier problem, but as I said, voter registration doesn't actually help solve that issue. It's just as easy to assume a fake identity when registering to vote as it is to fake an identity when actually voting. Easier in some respects, since most voter registration happens through the mail, but I promise you, the person Andy Dufresne's invented through the mail in The Shawshank Redemption to steal Warden Norton's money today also could have registered to vote in Maine. I mentioned earlier that people who love voter ID requirements, demanding that people produce an official government photo identification document before allowing them to vote, should understand that such a policy makes voter registration entirely irrelevant. I, however, do not support voter ID. That's because voter ID is just another form of pre registration. It's another hoop that already eligible voters need to jump through before the election before they are allowed to participate in the government that rules over them. Getting an ID and keeping it up to date costs money. Not a lot of money for people who can maintain a basic standard of living, but a not insignificant amount of money for people living at or below the poverty line. Most importantly, it costs time. Places like a local Department of Motor Vehicles are usually open only when people are working, and we do not live in a society where wage earners can simply not work for a day without costing themselves real money. My entire theory of the case is that in a democracy, the onus is on the government to make sure it knows who is eligible to vote, not on the citizens to prove their eligibility to the government. If I show up to vote and the government doesn't know who I am, that should be their problem, not mine. Elections should be a time-intensive, administratively costly, and expensive affair for the government holding the election, but a quick, frictionless, and free experience for the people who wish to participate in the election. This country has it entirely backward when it treats the process of voting as a thing that should burden its citizens rather than its government. But we do it this way because we know that many eligible voters will not provide proof to the government and thus can be excluded from participating in their own democracy. In a normal pro democracy book, I'd now show how voter registration rules suppress votes with a real world example from Florida or Texas or a former Confederate state where the spirit of Jim Crow still animates the state's laws. But I actually think my solidly blue, allegedly liberal home state of New York provides the perfect example of how suppressive voter registration rules can be. As we've discussed, New York is an original gangsta of voter registration rules because most of the political history of the state is white people living upstate or on Long Island using every trick imaginable to cut the overwhelmingly political power of New York City and the immigrants who dwell there. New York's voter eligibility requirements are fairly standard. You have to be 18 and a U.S. citizen, which is stupid, but whatever. You can't be in prison for a felony conviction. Also stupid, but more on this later. And you can't be adjudged to be mentally incompetent. Seems unfair to the Trump family. And you have to be a resident of the state and the country in which you vote for 30 days prior to the election. Those who meet these requirements still need to register to vote at least 10 days prior to the election. Thanks to the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, also known as the Motor Voter Act, New Yorkers, like everybody else, can register via the Department of Motor Vehicles when they get their driver's licenses or non driver ID cards. But getting a driver's license is somewhat less standard in New York City than it is in the rest of the country, as it remains one of the only places in the United States where you can comfortably live without owning a car or having a driver's license. If a New Yorker doesn't want to go to the DMV, they can also register in person at a county board of elections or by the mail. You'll need a state license number, a social security number, a valid photo ID, or some other utility bill, financial statement, or government form that shows your address. But if you use one of the latter forms of identification, you may still need to show photo ID before you vote. New York also does online registration, though you need to have previously registered for a statewide login name or register to do so, which is a multi step process. On the face of these eligibility and registration laws, New York is plainly disadvantaging one core group of eligible voters who make up a large part of the population of the state, and especially New York City: renters. In a city where most voters are renters and are often on the move, that 30-day residency requirement is a problem. Providing proof of residency to meet voter registration requirements effectively changes the 10-day pre registration period into a 30-day period, unless you remember to show up at the Board of Elections with bills from your former and current apartment. And obviously, proof of residency is even harder to come by if you are homeless or living in a shelter, or squatting or couch surfing with friends until a unit opens up that you can afford. We like to think that New York no longer has property requirements to vote, but try telling that to someone who can't afford the normal pathways to rent. The real voter suppression, however, comes from all the things New York's voter registration rules don't allow. New York does not have what's called portability, which means that your voter registration doesn't follow you as you move within the state or even within the city. If you move from Brooklyn to Queens, you have to update your registration. If you move to the east side, you have to update your registration. Technically, if you move from one unit in your building to another, you have to update your registration. This is how many people end up with inactive voter registrations. If you are registered but don't vote in a few consecutive elections, the Board of Elections will send a notice to your listed residence. You have to respond attesting that you still live there. If you don't live there anymore or simply don't respond to the snail mail notice, because seriously, who are these people who still check their physical mail every day, and when will they finally die? Your registration can be set to inactive and you will be unable to vote on election day. If enough time passes, these voters will be purged from the registration rolls altogether. And then there are the formerly incarcerated. Unlike in some states, people convicted of felonies who have served their time and are released from prison or are out on parole allegedly have their voting rights restored automatically in New York State. They don't have to pay a bunch of unclear legal financial obligations or shine Ron DeSantis' white rain boots or fulfill whatever fresh horrors they've invented in Florida. But formerly incarcerated New Yorkers still have to re-register upon or after release. I don't think the word automatic means what New York State election officials think it means. This kind of voter suppression could be somewhat mitigated if New York offered same-day voter registration, but New York does not. The pathetic Democrats who currently run my state have been patting themselves on the back because New York recently adopted same-day registration on the first day of early voting, but that is just an ad campaign. Early voting in New York starts, wait for it, 10 days before the election, which happens to be the precise deadline for pre-registration. Can you same-day register on the second day of early voting 9 days before the election? No, you cannot. I sometimes honestly can't tell if the state's leaders are stupid or just think that we are. New York doesn't offer same-day registration, and it also doesn't offer same-day correction of voter information. If you show up on election day and your voter registration has you living in apartment 1A, but you've moved to apartment 2B and forgot to update that information, Your best bet is just to lie and say you still live at 1A. Not that I've done that before. No, no, not me. There's no easy way to fix the error on the day of the election. As the philosopher Cicero might ask, cui bono? Who benefits? Who does this system of voter registration actually help? As in the past, modern voter registration primarily benefits landed elites. People who can afford to live in the same place over a long period of time have a voting advantage over people who are constantly getting priced out of their homes and communities, or people who have no homes to begin with. It helps older people who are more stable over younger people who are constantly on the move. It helps salaried employees who can spend an entire afternoon at the DMV at the cost of only their will to live over wage earners who cannot afford to have their business hours wasted. And in New York, it specifically helps people who own homes upstate or in the suburbs and who are thus tied to 30-year mortgages over renters living in the city who are always one rent guidelines board meeting away from needing to find a new building. Arguments can be made that voter registration restricts participation in ways that we should want. Maybe we do want longer term residents making decisions over transient renters. Maybe we do want older, more experienced people to have more political power than younger ones. Maybe being able to invest the time and energy to navigate through all the voter registration hoops is a good barrier because only the most committed citizens should have a voice in our republic. These arguments are exactly the kind of claptrap that would come out of John Adams' quill pen. Arguments about restricting democracy to only a few of the right people are, anti democratic arguments. In his time, Adams was trying to stop women, young people, poor people, and black people from voting. In our time, voter registration laws are trying to stop, well, young people and poor people from voting. And if those young or poor people happen to be women or black people, people in our time are totally down to exclude them too. The same protect rich white men at all cost argument has been made again and again throughout history, and it's always wrong. A ton of voting laws and rules on the books today are straight up anti democratic. UCLA law school professor and election law expert Richard Hasen has a book out called A Real Right to Vote, in which he argues for fixing this problem at the source by passing a constitutional amendment that recognizes a fundamental right to vote for the first time in American history. I would obviously support such an amendment. The lack of a right to vote is just an unmitigated failure of our Constitution and our entire republic. We are not the greatest democracy on earth because we lack the very simple, inalienable right to participate in that democracy. I'm focused on voter registration laws here. However, because it's a problem that's incredibly easy to fix, we could simply repeal these laws. Voter registration is not natural to democracy, not even the American pretend version of it. These laws showed up in force specifically to place voting barriers to immigrants and freed black people. They don't help us secure elections, and they're obsolete in terms of election administration. We could just do away with them. The way forward is automatic voter registration. It's so simple that William of Ockham could explain it while shaving. The government can determine who is eligible to vote based on lists it already has, including the census. All voters who are eligible that the government knows about are registered. All those who are eligible that the government doesn't know about are presumptively registered unless information is produced that they are not eligible. The end. That's how it's done in most of the rest of the world. Indeed, the United States is one of the only democracies in the entire world that doesn't have some form of automatic or compulsory voter registration, and our particular system of running voter registration through the states and then making that registration non transferable as people move is entirely unique and critically fucking stupid. In countries as varied as Argentina, Chile, Hungary, India, Israel, the Netherlands, and Sweden, voter registration is functionally automatic for all eligible citizens. In the United Kingdom and New Zealand, you get fined if you don't register, which is one way to do it if you really think that voter registration is that goddamn important. In Australia, you get fined if you don't register and fined if you don't vote. I'm not a fan of the fine, but I grudgingly respect it. And a Mel Gibson is an insane, crazy person, but an entertaining actor and a fantastic storyteller kind of way. Fundamentally, you could bring me around on what's called universal civic duty voting, an idea explored by E.J. Dionne and Miles Rappaport in their book 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting, where everybody is required to vote even if they leave their ballot entirely blank. In the United States, only North Dakota doesn't have any voter registration laws. Every other state has some kind of voter registration requirement that forces citizens to do the government's work and prove that they are eligible to vote. Some states allow this to happen on the day of the election, most don't, but always and everywhere in this country, the burden is placed on the voter instead of on the government. We should stop doing that. Voting should be a right, but in the meantime, it shouldn't be a fucking chore.